The United Nations is calling for an immediate ceasefire in Yemen. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon says he's gravely concerned about the ground fighting and airstrikes that have cut off food and medical supplies to the Yemeni people. Yemen is said to be at the center of a regional proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia for influence and power in the region. Over a three-week period, a Saudi-led coalition reportedly carried out over 2,300 airstrikes. Saudi Arabia says its goal is to oust Shiite Houthi rebels and restore the presidency of Abd-Rabbu Mansour Hadi, who fled the country and is now in exile. The Houthis, reportedly backed by Iran, seized the capital of Sana'a last September and are in control of most of Western Yemen. With us now to discuss the power play in the Middle East is Hillary Mann Leverett. She's a visiting scholar at Georgetown University and co-author of Going to Tehran, Why America Must Accept the Islamic Republic of Iran. Hillary, great to see you again.
Thank you.
So, as we are reporting, Saudi Arabia is leading this coalition that's bombing anti-government forces in Yemen. And over the weekend, we had disturbing news that cluster bombs are being used in the country as well. This surely must be destabilizing the situation even further.
Yes, and it's an interesting choice of words, bombing anti-government forces, because in reality, there are no targeted strikes on anti-government forces. It is a wide-ranging bombing campaign that has bombed hospitals, has bombed refugee centers, has bombed civilian targets, as well as what they may characterize as military targets. It's a wide-ranging political and military campaign with a goal. No one in Washington is sure what the goal is. What are the Saudis trying to achieve? And it is certainly an end result being destabilizing, empowering of al-Qaeda, and further inflaming the tensions throughout the entire region.
So Washington must be looking at this escalation in fighting right now. What is the response going to be from here?
Well, at first, I think there was surprise. There was surprise that the Saudis would once again intervene militarily in Yemen. The last time they did so in 2009, the Saudis fared very poorly against the Houthis. The Houthis actually were able to go into Saudi Arabia at that time. So there was some surprise here that the Saudis would go in militarily again. But very quickly, the political elite here in Washington consolidated with the Saudis to support the Saudi bombing campaign, provide intelligence, logistical, and military support to the Saudi bombing campaign. But now, several weeks later, Americans here are again wondering what is the Saudi end goal? And as the civilian casualty toll mounts, and as this instability in Yemen is increasingly clear, the power of al-Qaeda is increasingly surging throughout the country. They're taking over ports, cities, airports, prisons. The Americans are now concerned, and Secretary Kerry is reportedly going to Riyadh later this week to try to broker a ceasefire.
So he will be talking to Saudi Arabian leaders. Is he going to be talking to anybody else in the region?
From what we know so far, the trip is focused on Saudi Arabia. And the question, I think, is very interesting, given the upheaval in Saudi Arabia itself in terms of its political structure. Who will his key interlocutors be there? Is it the king, or is it the now very powerful, very young son of the king, who's the Minister of Defense, and the one who's really the face of this military campaign? It's his face that is on TV every day in Saudi Arabia. It is he and his image, his popularity that is surging in Saudi Arabia because of this campaign. So it'll be interesting to see whether Kerry focuses attention on him, this very young Minister of Defense, or whether he pays due deference to the king.
Why is Yemen so important to the United States strategically?
Well, there's some basic military territorial facts about it in terms of where it is in terms of international waterways, the export and transit of oil. But critically important for the United States, first and foremost, is that Yemen matters to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is the linchpin, is the pillar of U.S. policy in the Middle East, is the way that the United States exercises its hegemony in the Middle East. Without Saudi Arabia, we don't have that kind of policy. And for the Saudis, Yemen is incredibly important. And that's why we support this the Saudi campaign in Yemen, even though it is squarely against U.S. interests, especially in terms of how it's empowering al-Qaeda and even ISIS, the Islamic State, in Yemen and elsewhere.
Because the one other view we see of this fighting that is taking place in Yemen is that Yemen has effectively become a battlefield for a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran for influence in the region.
Yemen has been a battlefield for the Saudis for a very long time. Since both countries were established in the 1930s, Saudi Arabia has periodically intervened, not just militarily, but politically with a tremendous amount of money, building these hardcore Wahhabi schools, trying to sow seeds of sectarian discord. The Saudis have been doing this for decades in Yemen, and it hasn't always been vis-a-vis Iran. It was vis-a-vis Egypt, for example, in the 1960s, which led the then Egyptian government to send tens of thousands of troops, nearly half of whom died in Yemen, because Yemen is a battlefield that people use as a proxy war, but they don't leave. And so I think for others in the region, they're very, very concerned about what Saudi Arabia is doing, because Yemen, in a way like Afghanistan, is seen as a quagmire. Troops go in, but they don't leave victoriously.
Right, at this stage, Saudi Arabia is saying that it is carrying out these bombings at the request of President Hadi. That's the ousted Yemeni president. And I'm wondering to what extent, when we look at all these civilian casualties, when we look at this deteriorating humanitarian situation in the country, what is this doing to President Hadi's credibility and legitimacy in the country?
Well, President Hadi's term had expired in January. And so one of the reasons why the Houthi rebels were able to walk into Sana'a, there was no opposition. The military laid down their weapons. No opposition when the Houthi rebels walked into Sana'a was because Hadi had overstayed his presidential term. And so the popularity for Hadi had already subsided, if there even was a substantial base for him to begin with, had already deeply subsided. At this point, if you analyze the Twitter discourse, the media, some of the opinion polling that's been done, clearly Yemenis of all sects, not just Houthis or the greater Zaidi Shia sect, but all Yemenis see his leadership as disastrous. He has invited the Saudis to bomb the civilian infrastructure of the country, not just military targets, but again, hospitals and all sorts of civilian places. This is something that has been deeply destabilizing to his popularity as well as to the country.
How does Iran respond to what is going on?
Iran will once again, as in many of these other conflicts, has responded, and I think will continue to respond by taking the high ground. They have responded, and I think will continue to respond, by saying they support a diplomatic resolution. They support a democratic process. They support a ceasefire and negotiation. They have done this in Iraq and Afghanistan, in a range of arenas throughout the greater Middle East, and all to their benefit, because what they do is they support, not necessarily militarily, much more important, politically support these disenfranchised communities that are impossible to ignore, whether it's Palestinians in Gaza, whether it's the non-Pashtun communities in Afghanistan, the Shia in Iraq. Iran doesn't create these communities, but what it does is it politically supports these disenfranchised communities to participate in a political process. And then once a political process is formed, they come to power, and they, of course, are much more favorable to Iran in their foreign policy. That's how Iran wins over and over again, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, or I would presume Yemen in the end.
Well, we have the United Nations, which has been calling for a ceasefire, and as you've just pointed out, Iran's calling for a ceasefire as well. Realistically, is there a political solution here?
A political solution in terms of stabilizing the country. I think we have seen Yemen has been at war for many, many decades. There have been ebbs and flows in the military conflict. But Yemenis, even though it's a very diverse community of sects, of north-south divide, of a lot of different divides in the country, they have previously been able to come together to negotiate in national dialogue, to put forward governments that are not necessarily the most fantastic governments in the world, but bring a level of stability. They've been able to do it before, and I think with support from the international community, not just various regional players, particularly the Saudis, trying to manipulate an outcome, but with real support for a representative government that could come out of a real national dialogue, I think it can happen. It's happened before.
But will we be looking at something like devolved power for the regions, and with stability, coming to the country?
And that devolved power, decentralization, has been the recipe for stabilization in the past. Right. The question at this point is to devolve power, though, to give each of the major players, including and especially at this point the Houthis, power in a way that they want, so that they're not a rump state or a rump piece of territory with no access to oil and no access to water. Those are the two key issues. If each of the key parties, especially the Houthis, can have access to oil and access to water in a devolution of power, decentralization of power, this can certainly work. That's what they've been calling on, and that's the key to focus on.
Right, so we have the regional players, but we also have a lot of players inside Yemen itself. When we look at this broadly, I mean, are there going to be any winners and losers in this?
Yes, I think the Houthis have certainly won. They have come from a place 10 years ago where they were considered a radical rebel group that wasn't democratic, had no interest in a political process. Today, they're seen as a group that is going to be, that needs to be a very important part, a central part of a political process going forward. And they, even though they may not get everybody's vote, they're the ones who are seen as standing up to the foreign military intervener. So in terms of some of the dynamics, even though there's a broad spectrum of diversity in terms of sect and regional divide, the Houthis are clearly coming out ahead. The other group that unfortunately is coming out ahead, I think, from the international community is Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Because the Saudi intervention has eviscerated the more moderate Sunni Islamist political participants in the country, eviscerated them. And so at this point, Sunnis only have to turn to the more radical groups like Al-Qaeda and the increasingly strong Islamic State gaining a foothold in Yemen. So we see the Houthis are gaining power, and Al-Qaeda and even more radical forces like the Islamic State are gaining power and winning.
Hillary Mann Leverett, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.